Send your scariest workplace stories to us at eeriecast.com/submit and rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
If you find a hole in the wall, it's probably best to leave it alone. You'll find no glory there, my friend. That's one of our unspoken rules here at Dead and Roasted, along with don't dip your finger in the coffee beans, even when they whisper. Reminds me of a story, a tale of a plumber, a hole in the wall, and death. Not to worry, I'll be sharing more than tales of holes with you today. Sit back, relax, and ignore the coffee beans. These are tales from the break room. Gasping. From R. Strayer 625. I work as a plumber, and I like it. Plumbing isn't a glorified job, and most people think of it as a low-level trade. But I would say if it wasn't for us, none of you would have clean water or a home that isn't full of sewage. We do so much dirty work, and are so underpaid compared to what we provide. That being said, I love what I do, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. At least, that's what I thought. Until I had something happen to me. To this day, I cannot reconcile in my own mind. I work for a huge land developer. The company had been engaged in a bidding war for who would get the contract for a housing development built at the base of a dam. Since the drought had hit California, this land had previously been considered a floodplain. But after several years of low water, it was now redrawn as a potential housing platform, and bidding was fierce and reckless. My firm got the job, but at a real cost. We had to hire so many outside contractors it was hard to keep track of who was responsible for what. In addition to that, the land itself fought back with amazing force. Landslides, sinkholes, underground caverns, and overall soil erosion had made the construction schedule a minefield of delays, unforeseeable circumstances, and in general, money pits. In short, the entire project was a show of feces. I'm a plumbing supervisor, which means I oversee the entire operation when it comes to water, gas lines, and drainage. Needless to say, the past few months of this project have been taxing. I took the job because of my disability. I worked as a plumber for several years, but it takes a toll on the body, and over time my back gave up trying. 2 herniated discs is what my doctor told me. Thanks to my company's awesome insurance, the doctors are not really going to do anything about it until it starts affecting my work. So now I work more as a supervisor instead of a hands-on laborer. This is great until you get a call in the middle of the night that a situation has arisen that demands a supervisor's level of experience. Well, one night a call awoke me from a deep sleep. Angrily, I looked at my phone, only to be disappointed that I had missed 4 calls. Yeah, I say into the phone from a rather cozy bed. I winced and pulled my phone away from my ear as a tirade of obscenities flowed painfully out of the speaker. It was Tony, a new hire that I wasn't really keen on putting on the project. He was inexperienced, and he had a very bad temper. "What's the situation?" I asked as I pulled myself out of bed and began to don my work attire. He seemed to calm himself just enough to inform me in between outpourings of colorful language. Apparently, a whole storm drain collapsed because of the rain, filling a huge chasm in the ground and breaking through a wall, flooding 2 of the 3 subfloors. And of course, the wall it broke had most of the gas lines and water lines anchored to it. The pumps could barely keep ahead of the incoming water. Another deep sigh escaped me as I resigned myself to the task at hand. I was going to have to go down there and sort that mess out. I eventually arrived at the job site, finding it in a state of disarray. As I pulled up, my headlights swept the front of the house. I spotted my 2 employees who seemed to not notice my headlights. Anthony, the new guy, was ranting and raving to the point of incoherence. This sort of jostled my brain loose from the fog of sleep that my late-night corner store coffee had failed to do. Now, at that point, we'd been working 12-hour shifts to try and meet deadlines. I really didn't need this tonight. I tried, unsuccessfully, to calm Tony down, trying to get him to explain what was going on. Rick, the guy he was working with that had the misfortune of being assigned to work with Tony, was standing off to the side by the basement entrance, apparently staring off into the distance. Rick is a stand-up guy, a good plumber, a true gentle giant of a man who largely had been assigned to Tony because of his patience with the hot-headed younger man. Tony continued his tantrum, storming off, throwing his tools into the trunk of his car, yelling the entire time about how this was my problem now. I gave a wary look at the back of his car as he sped away through the dark neighborhood. For a moment, I was grateful that all the homes were empty. At least no one was here to see one of our plumbers behaving like an absolute child. Rick had come up from the basement steps to stand beside me, watching Tony's taillights disappear into the night. For such a large man, he barely made a sound and genuinely startled me when I pulled my rain hood back and caught him in my peripheral vision. Rick was in quite a state himself, soaking wet and covered in mud. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the last place we saw Tony's lights. He spoke with an odd inflection in his voice, something akin to sadness, or maybe shame for this job having gone as sideways as it possibly could. I put on the best professional tone I could muster through my sleep-deprived brain, directing Rick to just go on home for the evening, that I would take it from here. It was going to be a long night, no matter how good I was at the job. I went back to my truck, starting to pull out all my wet weather gear. A pair of overalls meant for this kind of work, waterproof and designed for the job. This was something I was very happy to have. I took the first step down the cellar, wading into the freezing water, relieved that I had the presence of mind to put on my thermals under my work clothes. I had just reached the bottom of the steps, beginning to assess the scene, before a voice startled me again. "Rick, man, you keep scaring the heck out of me tonight," I said aloud. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, with that same tone of sadness laden in his voice. Maybe a little too harshly, I responded. "No, Rick, go home." He didn't utter a response, and when I looked back up the stairwell, he was gone. Okay, I thought, maybe now I could have a little peace and quiet, just to focus on the task at hand. I turned my attention back to the work that needed to be done tonight. Apparently, the existing drainage system that had been installed had clogged, thus failing after the wall gave way, filling the drains with mud and debris, not allowing the water to drain out of the basement. This had filled 2 of the 3 basement levels, and at its highest, it reached my waist. Now, water was flowing out the windows of the lowest 2 levels of the basement, making them inaccessible to me, until the emergency pumps had a chance to catch up with the water flow. The wall that had caved in had most of our work anchored to it, and a steady stream of water was pouring into the building from it. I decided to come back out of the flood and call local municipal agencies to see if anyone had located the collapsed drainage pipe. My initial impression was that even our emergency pumps would not really get far enough ahead of the flood if the water had nowhere else to go but into this home. I finally got a hold of an emergency services coordinator. He was able to put me in contact with a crew working on a storm drain on the other side of the hill where the collapse had taken place. His crews had been working the past few hours, but still had at least an hour before reaching the caved-in section. For me, this was a double-edged sword. It meant I couldn't just call off for the night, saying there was nothing I could do. I had to stay and start the process of getting repairs completed. This was certainly proving to be a call I should have let go to voicemail. I took a moment to feel sorry for myself, then steeled myself for the long night ahead. I started uninstalling all the previous work that couldn't be salvaged, cutting away damaged lines and fittings that had been stripped of their threads during the collapse. Sparks flew and concrete dust hung in the air as I went about my work, constantly keeping an eye on the hole in the wall, wondering when the emergency crews might get their end done, so at the very least water would stop draining in, giving the pumps a chance to get caught up. Somewhere around 2:30 a.m., the sound of the water entering through the hole in the wall began to slow. I'd been so focused on my music and work, I almost fell backwards into the water, having been subconsciously holding my body tense against the flow. Having to suddenly adjust my stance was my only clue to look up, noticing the water was slowing. As the last trickles stopped, the room felt eerily quiet. The sudden sensation of stillness overtook the room, giving a feeling of being alone in a once occupied space. I made my way toward the hole with a sense of morbid curiosity as to how bad the damage could be on the other side. I felt almost drawn to it. Wading through the water, I noticed it began to feel colder the closer I went to the breach. Cold air wafted down through the opening. I waded over to my tool bag and retrieved my industrial flashlight. I figured 100,000 lumens would be adequate to see whatever was on the other side. I grabbed a ladder so that I could reach the opening. My suspicions were confirmed. As I grew closer, the water had dropped in temperature drastically. With a sense I could only call a mix of anticipation and anxiety, I peered into the gaping maw that was the hole. Immediately, I found my own vision woefully inadequate to even begin to pierce the darkness. A click of the flashlight and 100,000 lumens flooded what proved to be a rather large opening beyond the wall, almost a cave. My first impression was that it was a large open cavern, but as I cast my light, I could make out more details of open tunnels. Several openings spotted the cavern, looking almost carved by water from the storm. The whole area began to look like a natural storm drainage, carved over time by relentless water flow. Then a small alarm began to go off in my head. Something I couldn't quite place yet, but it steadily grew as I examined the structure of the cave. I tried to force my exhausted brain to spit out the answer, but sleep deprivation and exhaustion was holding my answer at bay. I tried to focus again, only finding the extra effort akin to blowing on an ember that refused to ignite. So I just shoved the itching thought to the back of my mind, knowing there's still more work to be done before I can justify going home. I backed away from the opening, that itching thought telling me not to take my eyes off it just yet. Again, I pushed the thought away, turning away from the breach. At the same time, though, I heard the distinct sound of something large splash into the water just beyond the wall. I turned my attention quickly back to the opening, shining my light in. I saw water rippling about, but only slightly. It was then the gates opened, finally releasing the flood of dread that I had been batting away all evening. The feeling of no longer being alone, accompanied by that cold shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature of the water, finally began to leave me. I was just standing there staring into the dark opening when the music playing through my Bluetooth began to skip, snapping me out of my stupor. I turned to address the speaker, turning my back to the opening again, when the generators running the pumps began to sputter out as well. This made no sense. I'd fueled them up when I'd arrived. They should be good to go for a few more hours, even if they were running at full tilt. The cold feeling redoubled its efforts to draw another shiver out of me when the emergency light began to dim too. My mind started to race with thoughts of being alone in the dark, with whatever had been in that hole? I desperately began to ascend the ladder, when precisely what I didn't want to have happen, happened. My weather gear got caught on something. In my panic, I tried to overcorrect my forward momentum and only made the situation worse by adding force to my descent into the chilly water. I frantically tried to reach out and grab a bit of wall, only to bring it down on top of myself as more of the cinder block wall gave way. I was sent underwater, with a small portion of the wall driving me into the freezing cold. The initial chill of the water was dreadful, but the immediate pain from something incredibly sharp was miles worse. True palpable fear dawned on me. I struggled beneath the water as some small part of my brain told me I'd been impaled by a piece of rebar in my thrashing attempt to remain on my feet. I fought desperately to free myself from the rebar in my arm, only to find it hooked and crooked, making all my attempts futile. I nearly passed out under the water from the sheer pain. As panic set in, a dim part of my consciousness recognized the lights had finally died out, leaving me alone in the dark in agony, and I was drowning. My lungs burned with the effort of keeping the water out, but I hadn't taken a good breath before the plunge, and I knew it was only a matter of time before my will gave in to biology, forcing me to gasp for air. The freezing water burned my lungs. I could feel my innards spasm. I was now in a full-blown panic. I soon realized my efforts to free myself were beginning to slow and weaken. The only light was that of my headlamp. For a moment, I thought it too had begun to die, having been submerged in water with me. It's funny what final thought came to mind at the moment. I thought I was going to die, but what came to mind was the stupid packaging that headlamp had come in when I first bought it. The packaging had said, "Waterproof to 100 meters or your money back." I wasn't getting any money back. But maybe the light wasn't dimming. Maybe it was my vision. My brain giving me a dark last thought, reminding me that the light wasn't dying, Bob. You are. Suddenly, a pair of tremendous hands pulled me free from the rebar and above the surface of the water in a slow but deliberate motion. Breaking the surface, I gagged, my consciousness coming back, along with the searing pain in my arm. I coughed and began to exhale water from my lungs, trying not to vomit in between gasps. The iron grip pulled my arm over a well-muscled shoulder. Then a hefty arm was placed around my waist to steady me. Then someone began to carry me. I remember through the haze, wondering if whatever had pulled me free was carrying me back toward the breach, when a familiar voice said, "I got you, Bob." It was Rick. Thank God. He'd come back to check on me. Still heaving for air and trying to gain my wits, I was carried to what I assumed was the stairs leading out of the basement. I felt Ricky lift me to the bottom of the first step, then up another and another. I can't seem to put anything together in the way of coherent thought, but I recall the blast of air accompanying a mild rain when Rick opened the basement doors. He dropped me unceremoniously on the top landing, at which point I landed on my wounded arm. I tried to scream, but the sound that escaped me would probably be best described as a disgruntled moan. I vaguely recall a half-hearted attempt to lift my arm into my field of vision to examine the damage, only to fall back into the well of unconsciousness. What I remember next is a bright light shining into my eyes, being loaded into an ambulance. I assumed Rick had called EMS, and slipping in and out of consciousness, I had the thought that my injuries must have been worse than I thought, given the amount of fuss and commotion that appeared to be happening all around the job site. After that, I woke up in a hospital bed. Doctors informed me that the damage to my arm had been fairly extensive, lacerating an artery, resulting in excessive blood loss. The rebar had also severed a few tendons, which I was told would require at least a few surgeries to regain the use of my hand. As I lay there in my hospital bed, With the news that odds are my days as a plumber were most likely at an end, I began to feel sorry for myself. I started to ask about my coworkers. The doctor cut me off and froze me with a deep look of professional regret that only comes from years of delivering bad news. He told me Ricky's body had been found floating on the other side of the breach in the wall. My mind reeled, attempting to recall the events. It wasn't possible, I told them, because Ricky had carried me out of that place and pulled me from the rebar. The doctor's look of professional remorse deepened as he explained to me, as if talking to a child, that blood loss like I'd experienced could cause memory loss and hallucinations. I began to become more agitated, raising my voice, attempting to get out of the bed. Upon standing to my feet, dizziness overtook me. I couldn't balance. I fell to the floor and blacked out. When I woke up again, I was restrained in the bed. After several more rounds of being talked to like a child by nurses, doctors, and police, I resigned myself to the knowledge that if I kept this up, I would more likely end up in a psych ward than ever have them believe me. The police took reports. It was stated that Ricky's death was an accidental drowning. The new guy on our team, during his interview, said that Ricky had gone back into the other side of the breach, attempting to ascertain where the water flow was coming from, and never came back out. I tried to convince myself that maybe I did hallucinate Ricky carrying me out of the place. After some psych evaluations, I was allowed to leave on my own recognizance. I was very much ready to go home. The day I was able to get dressed and leave the hospital, I saw something which brought all the cold memories to the surface again. My whole body had been covered in ugly bruises, which had begun to heal in a variety of unpleasant colors. But one set stood out in particular. Across the bicep of my uninjured arm, a set of bruises had begun to heal, but were still very clearly visible. Perhaps it was my own mind trying to make any sense of what had happened. Maybe grief runs deeper than I thought possible. However, in my own mind, the bruising looked like a large man's hand squeezing my arm. I'll never know what happened down in that basement, but I still hold on to the belief that Rick pulled me from that nightmare, whether he was alive or not. Creepy babysitting encounters. From Dawn. I was raised by a single mother, and money was always tight. Throughout high school, I worked various odd jobs around my quiet suburban town in Southern California to save for college and to have a little spending money. I used to babysit for a handful of families, mostly ones we knew from church and friends of friends. I loved kids, and compared to my part-time job at Burger King, I thought it was a pretty easy way to make some money. I came to realize over time, however, that not every babysitting gig would be a walk in the park. 2 nights in particular haunt my nightmares, even now, well over 10 years since the events took place. The first unsettling experience I had happened shortly after I turned 16. It was late winter. I was babysitting for a family we'll call the Reynolds. They had 2 sweet girls, a 7-year-old named Scarlett and a 9-year-old named Ivy. They lived in a nice house near the outskirts of town, where the houses were farther apart and the surrounding forest was dense. Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds went out on a date every other Friday night, so I was at their house fairly often. This particular occasion started off unremarkably. Just another peaceful evening of board games, cartoons, pizza for dinner, and reading to Scarlett and Ivy before they went to bed. With the girls sound asleep upstairs, I did my usual routine of loading up the dishwasher and tidying the kitchen before settling into the living room to catch up on some homework. As the hours wore on, a sense of unease slowly crept over me. The house felt unusually quiet, and I remember turning the TV on for some background noise. I glanced reflexively at the front door which was right next to a large glass window. The curtains were wide open, as they often were. I don't know what exactly compelled me to get up and close the curtains, but I still thank God that I did. Reaching for the curtains, I suddenly noticed there was a figure standing at the edge of the front yard, barely visible in the dim streetlight. My heart skipped a beat. I did not recognize this person, and their presence at this hour on this quiet cul-de-sac was unsettling. How long had they been standing there? I yanked the curtains closed and double-checked the locks on the front door before peeking from the corner of the window as subtly as I could. The figure remained still for a moment before taking slow, deliberate steps towards the front door. With each step they took, my heart sank into my stomach. I held my breath as they ascended the porch steps, reached out, and lightly tapped on the door, a soft rhythmic sound that echoed through the house. Fear gripped me. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Could there be a reasonable explanation for this? Could this be a neighbor seeking help? Someone lost in the neighborhood at this late hour, tapping so as to not wake the family if they were already asleep? Or was this something more sinister? I tiptoed toward the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. Through the peephole, I could barely make out a man's silhouette, his face obscured in darkness. He reached out and tapped again, the sound hauntingly deliberate. I was frozen, my heart racing. Summoning all my courage, I called out, "Can I help you?" There was no response, just the eerie sound of more soft tapping. I debated calling the police, but I hesitated. For some reason, I thought that the responsible thing to do was to handle this situation myself and not alarm the Reynolds, unless it was absolutely necessary. I didn't want to overreact. I mean, the front door was locked and deadbolted, and I had checked the locks on the back door and garage door just an hour earlier. I tried to convince myself that this situation was not a big deal. Maybe the man had the wrong address. And what would I even tell the police? Someone's knocking on the door, oh no. Such was my thought process at the time. As I panicked over my next move, the figure finally spoke, his voice low and strained, barely audible through the door. "Please let me in. It's urgent." A chill ran down my spine. There was something off about his tone, a sense of urgency that didn't sound authentic, and certainly didn't match the slow pace with which he'd approached the front door. I stepped back instinctively, heart pounding, not really sure what to do next. Then, without warning, the tapping stopped. Silence engulfed the house, a suffocating stillness broken only by the soft sounds from the television behind me and the distant hum of the night. To my horror, the silence was broken as the doorknob began to rattle, and the man tried to force the door open. Then, as quickly as it started, it all stopped, and there was silence again. I was frozen there on my feet. I cautiously approached the window again after some time, and I peered outside. The figure was gone, vanished into the darkness without a trace. I scanned the yard, feeling a sense of relief mixed with lingering dread. I ran around the first floor, triple-checking the locks on every door and window while drawing all the curtains closed. I went upstairs to check on the girls who were, thankfully, still sound asleep. I stayed on edge for the remainder of the night, constantly checking on Ivy and Scarlett while keeping a close eye on the front yard, unnerved by this encounter with the stranger. When the Reynolds returned just after midnight, I debated telling them about the odd stranger at the door. In the end, even though I was shaken up, I decided not to worry them. I thought there were many plausible explanations, and ultimately the man had simply left, I guess. Now that I'm older, I know in my gut that man had sinister intentions. To this day, I compulsively check the locks on my doors and feel very uncomfortable with the curtains open at night. You never know who could be peering in, shielded by the dark, watching you. My second story is one that disturbs my sense of safety even now. I was 17 years old, babysitting for a family that I'd met through another family at church. The parents, we'll call them Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, had a lively little 5-year-old girl named Amy. I had babysat for them a handful of times without incident before. It was another typical evening of playing with dolls, eating dinner, watching a movie, and getting little Amy ready for bed. She always insisted that I not leave her side until she was fast asleep, and tonight was no different. Eventually, I was satisfied by her slow, even breathing and quietly extracted myself from her colorful nest of stuffed animals and pillows. As the night grew late, Mrs. Thompson texted me, apologizing for the delay. She asked if I could stay just a bit longer. They were running behind. I agreed, though this would mean my mom would not be able to pick me up, as she had to start her late-night shift at the hospital. When Amy's parents finally showed up just after 1 a.m., a flustered Mrs. Thompson hurriedly thanked me and offered to call a taxi for my ride home. But Mr. Thompson insisted on driving me himself, saying it was late and he didn't want me outside waiting alone. Reluctantly, I agreed. The drive started off normal enough, polite conversation about school and the upcoming holidays. But as we neared my house, Mr. Thompson's demeanor shifted. His tone grew hushed, and he began to ask oddly personal questions, like whether I had a boyfriend. When I said no, he shifted his gaze to me and slyly asked, "Well, do you want one?" I felt a knot form in my stomach, a growing sense of discomfort. Surely, I thought, he was just trying to make playful small talk to pass the time. But this felt inappropriate. I awkwardly laughed and told him, "Not really," before turning to look out the passenger side window for the remainder of the drive. When we reached my street, Mr. Thompson slowed the car, saying that he needed to discuss something important. Chills went down my spine, and I stammered, "Mr. Thompson, it's already late. I really need to get home. My mom will be worried." Instead, he pulled over on a dark road, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my heart race. He started talking about how much he appreciated my help with Amy and how he had noticed me around the neighborhood. I don't remember everything he said, because I was freaking the heck out, but I do remember him going on and on about how he wasn't happy in his marriage and hadn't been for a long time. He concluded by saying that I was a very pretty girl, and that any man would be lucky to date me. He said he was happy to have me around, and that he thought of me as family, even though this was only the 6th, maybe the 7th time I'd babysat Amy. He went on and on for what felt like ages. His words sounded innocent, but his unwavering gaze felt invasive and predatory. I felt trapped in that car. My mind was ringing with alarm bells. I felt sick to my stomach. I tried to keep calm, thanking him and attempting to open the locked door. That's when he reached out, his hand brushing over my thigh. This sent shivers up my spine. His touch felt lingering and inappropriate, and absolutely uninvited. I jerked away, my heart pounding in terror. I managed to open the door. I bolted out, running towards my house without looking back. I could hear him calling after me, but I didn't stop until I made it back to the safety of my front door, fumbling with my keys in a panic. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. Immediately, I called my mom, tears streaming down my face as I recounted the unsettling ride home. She tried to comfort me, saying that surely Mr. Thompson had not intended to make me uncomfortable, After all, he was a church-going, married man with a beautiful family. When my mom asked me again if I was absolutely certain that Mr. Thompson had been making some kind of pass at me, I hung up the phone and never brought the incident up again. The Thompsons never reached out for me to babysit again, and I made sure to avoid any encounters with Mr. Thompson. I've run through what happened a million times in my head, trying to figure out if I overreacted. Nothing he had said had been particularly threatening or inappropriate, but I can't shake the feeling that the totality of Mr. Thompson's behavior was creepy and off-color. I wonder what his intentions were with me to this day, but I'm glad I never found out. That night left me shaken, a reminder that sometimes the people we think are safe can harbor sinister intentions. It was a chilling experience that made me more cautious and aware of the dangers lurking in seemingly normal situations. I still think about that sweet little girl, Amy, and I hope that I misinterpreted the situation with her dad, because I hate to think of what it could mean for her if I was right. Delivery to Hell. From Jake. I'm a pizza delivery guy in a small, sleepy town in Oregon. I'm the kind of person who tries to see the best in people and situations. I've always liked the quietness of night shifts, the way the world seems to slow down. But one night, my perspective changed completely. It was a chilly November evening, and I was working the closing shift. Business had been slow, and I was looking forward to just heading home. That's when a call came in for a delivery to an address on the outskirts of town. It was to a place I'd never been to before, an old area with a reputation for being deserted. As I drove, the familiar city lights gave way to darkness, broken only by the dim glow of my car's headlights. The road was unnervingly quiet, no other cars in sight. When I made it to the address, I was greeted by an old house, its paint peeling and windows dark. It looked like nobody had lived there for years. Feeling uneasy, I checked the order again, thinking maybe I got the address wrong. But no, it was correct. I grabbed the pizza and walked up the front door. There was no doorbell, so I had to knock. But when I did, I didn't get an answer. So I knocked louder. Still nothing. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint noise from inside the house. It sounded like a whisper, but it was hard to tell. My heart began to quicken its pace. Maybe someone was in there after all. I called out, "Pizza delivery!" hoping for a response. Silence followed. Then, suddenly, the faint sound again, like someone struggling to speak. It was coming from inside that house. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I walked around the corner, and that's when I saw something. The basement window was open, and there was a faint light flickering inside. I peered in, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There was a person in there, tied up and gagged, frantically trying to get my attention, looking into my eyes through the window with despair. My mind reeled in a panic. I quickly fumbled out my phone to call 911, but of course, the signal out here in the outskirts was horrible. It was then that I heard the front door creak open behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, to see who had come out of the house. But there was no one there. The front door was just hanging wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. I was torn between running away and trying to help this person in the basement. The image of them down there, I had to do something. I dashed back to my car, grabbing a flashlight. Not so much for the light, but at least to have something that felt like protection. I then made my way to the open basement window. The flickering light inside revealed a narrow, cluttered space. The person still sat there, struggling, their eyes wide with fear. "Hang on, I'm gonna help you," I whispered, trying to reassure them and myself. I looked for a way in and found that the window was just big enough for me to crawl through. Once inside, I finally noticed the person was a young woman, bound and terrified. She mouthed the words, "Be careful." I quickly worked to untie her. My hands trembled as I removed her gag. She gasped, "He's still here." Those words hit me like a ton of bricks. Her captor could return at any moment. I helped the woman to her feet, and we quietly made our way to the stairs leading up to the main floor. Every creak of the old wood under our feet sounded deafening in the silence. We reached the main floor and began to move towards the front door. And we heard it then, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the back of the house. We froze, and then, acting on instinct, I pulled her into a nearby closet. We huddled together in the dark, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped. The tension in the air was unbearable. We heard him out there, moving around and muttering to himself. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps began to move away, and the back door opened in the distance and closed. We waited just a minute more, listening closely. When it seemed safe, we crept from the closet and hurried out the front door. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, which I had parked just down the street. I drove as fast as I could back to town, calling 911 along the way. Later on, some officers met us at the hospital. The woman I'd saved, her name was Emily. She was treated for minor injuries and shock. I gave my statement, my hands shaking from the adrenaline still. Turns out that Emily had been missing for 2 days. The police later caught the captor, who was a known criminal in the area. He was also an ex-boyfriend to Emily, who basically went insane after she broke up with him, then kidnapped her. For those who are wondering who ordered that pizza, it was later found out by the police that the captor ordered it. But why didn't he answer the door? Why would he risk getting caught? I don't know. That night changed me. I was hailed a hero, but I didn't feel like one. Let's be honest. We were lucky. We both could have been killed there. I quit that delivery job soon after. It just didn't feel safe anymore. It didn't feel the same. Happy Holiday from Chai. My small bookstore is open during the holidays. Older folks come in frequently for Hallmark romance books, and younger folks often come in for the fantasy section. There's even a rare few who still come in for the dark romances. This happened last year, and honestly, I had mostly forgotten about it, until I was listening to one of these podcasts on my lunch break. Last year, the day after Thanksgiving, we were open bright and early. The snow was laying thick on the ground, so I was a few minutes late getting into work. I opened up the doors and took the time to straighten up after the night before. I don't know how I left it such a mess, but there were books on the ground in a neat circle from where I was reading the famous Howl's Moving Castle. The night had been slow, so I allowed myself the guilty pleasure of reading. I often found myself doing this during the slower nights. The only abnormality I saw was the back room's light was on, and that was something I couldn't account for. It caught me off guard and honestly startled me. I usually made it a point to stay out of that room late at night, because, frankly, it scares me. It always has, as it had always been the largest and darkest room with horrible, unreliable lighting. I took pause, setting my lunch on the counter, staring long and hard at the open and well-lit room. I heard scraping noises, and so I slowly made my way back out of the door, being careful to not make too much noise. I took my phone out, making a call to the store owner. She was a sweet older woman in her mid-60s. She informed me that she hadn't been there today. She'd been spending the day with her family. We did have one other employee, but he was in San Fran for the week, so there was someone else unaccounted for in there, and that alone was terrifying. I called the non-emergency line for the local police, and they said they would be there within 10 minutes. I really didn't want to chance it being something that seriously needed attention and not having any backup. I heard stacks of books being knocked over and deep, irritated noises that didn't quite sound like something a person would make. I instantly thought of a bear, but there were no tracks in the snow from what I could see. Then again, I couldn't really see the back of the store, and I didn't want to risk trying to get a look. A policeman I was very familiar with showed up within a few minutes, looking rather amused. "So you went from thinking it was a break-in to thinking it was a bear. Liz, are you sure you just didn't want an excuse to see me?" I frowned. He was always one for jokes, but I just pushed him towards the door. "Well, go and see. They're tearing up the back, whoever or whatever it is." I picked up a heavy light by the front door, holding it firmly in my grasp, as Jake, the policeman, headed towards the sounds. Before we could see what it was, the back door slammed open and a large shape ran through. Jake took after them, yelling at me to stay still and lock the doors. I certainly did lock the doors, but I also snapped pictures of the damage that had been done. Pallets of books strewn everywhere, food tossed among the books, and worst of all, sloppily written on the wall in what appeared to be ketchup was, "Happy Holidays, Liz." Honestly, that really messed with me. It meant it was someone I knew, and worse yet, they had been in there, waiting for me to arrive. Maybe they'd been in there last night with me. Maybe they'd spied on me. It took a few weeks after this incident for me to calm down and regain any normalcy. Jake said that he wasn't able to catch whoever that was. He seemed to have just disappeared among the alleyways of the business park. A year later, no update. No clue to whom that was. Well, happy holidays, everyone. And to our intruder, please don't come back this year. Tales from a Housekeeper. From Cade. Warning from the author. This story contains mentions of death and self-harm. If you've ever worked or spent a lot of time in hotels, you'll be well aware that they're usually haunted. I mean, plenty of people die in hotels. I've been a housekeeper for a few years now, and the first hotel I worked at was quite run down. Most of the rooms had stained furniture, mold in the bathrooms, and we were encouraged to do a bad job at cleaning in order to clean more quickly. Once, while servicing a stayover room, I found the bathroom covered in blood. Apparently, some couple had been staying there, and the wife attempted to kill herself the night before. I'm not really sure what happened to them. Another time, I walked into a room to find the curtains torn down, shower rod torn out of the wall, a huge pile of bloody towels, and the bed sheets disheveled and covered in blood. Thankfully, I didn't have to clean that room, but because we found no evidence of drug use or weapons, and no one had noticed anything suspicious with the guests, we technically didn't have a crime to report. I really hope that someone was just drunk and had an accident, and I didn't walk into a crime scene. Now, the entire first floor had fake hardwood flooring in the rooms, except for one. That was room 126. Room 126 was the only room that still had the old linoleum from before renovations that happened several years prior. More than once, I saw guests asking to be moved from that particular room, or straight up leaving the hotel without spending the night. A few of them claimed the room just creeped them out. I never questioned this. I always just thought it was their excuse to not have to stay in a crappy hotel. One day, I was cleaning the tub in that room. I had headphones on and my butt in the air. I was vigorously scrubbing when I clearly heard a woman's voice say, "Excuse me," in a stern tone. I jumped. It sounded like that voice came from right behind me. But I always push my cleaning cart in front of the door so that no one can enter the room and sneak up on me like that, especially while I have headphones in. I practically jumped up and peeked my head out of the bathroom to see if a guest needed something. But there was no one there. I moved my cart and looked out into the hall. No one. A few other times I would be at the table or desk, wiping it down, and out of the corner of my eye I could swear there was a person standing at the door expectantly. But when I turned my head and looked, there would be no one there. To be fair, this happens quite a bit, and it's usually just a trick of the light. But it happened way more in 126 than any other room. Close to the time I quit, I finally asked why that room had different flooring than the rest. I wasn't prepared for the answer my boss gave me. Turns out, about a year before she was hired, an older lady who was living at the hotel died in that room. But to make matters worse, she was an animal hoarder and secretly kept dozens of cats in the room with her for years. When they found her, her corpse was half eaten. They also found more than a few dead cats in the room with her too, and a few live ones, of course. I think it's likely that her and a few of her kitties never checked out. They turned room 126 into a storage room for a while after that. The rest of the hotel got new floors, but not 126. This disturbed me, and even though it has been a while since I left that place, I still think about it all the time, and how those cats and that old lady are probably stuck there, linked to the very floor they perished on. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com.